You drove home after the session and the therapist had said exactly the right things, and you knew, quietly, privately, in a way you weren't about to say out loud, that it hadn't touched the thing. Not because it was a bad session. It wasn't. The therapist was skilled, the work was honest, you came out clearer about a few patterns, lighter about a few memories. By any reasonable measure, it had helped. And yet, there was something underneath all of that. Something older and heavier and more stubborn that the session had moved around but never quite reached. Like rearranging furniture in a house where the foundation is cracked. You've probably told yourself it's a matter of time. More sessions, better techniques, the right diagnosis, and maybe that's true for some of what you're carrying. But I want to put something in front of you tonight that took me a long time to be able to say out loud. There is a kind of suffering for which therapy was never designed. Not because therapy is wrong, because it's reaching for something at one level of human experience, and the thing you're describing lives at a different level entirely. Voegelin had a name for it. He was a political philosopher, born in Cologne in 1901, forced to flee Vienna in 1938 when the Gestapo opened a file on him for his books criticizing Nazi racial theory, and he spent the rest of his long life developing what turned out to be one of the most precise diagnostic tools in the history of Western thought. He called the disorder pneumopathology. And once you understand what he meant, you will not be able to unsee it. That is the promise of this video. A name, a precise one, not a repackaging of the culture is broken, you've heard that, not a political diagnosis for people you disagree with, a name for something you may be experiencing right now, in your own life, in your own tradition, whether or not you've ever opened a philosophy book. Stay with me. Let me start with what therapy actually does, because I want to be honest about this. I'm not building a case against it. And I don't want you to walk away from this thinking you should stop anything that's helping you. Therapy, at its best, operates at the level of what psychologists call the psyche, the emotional, behavioral, cognitive dimensions of a person's life. It can identify patterns of thought that generate suffering. It can trace emotional wounds back to their origin. It can help you regulate responses that have become destructive, rebuild relationships that have been damaged, and recover functioning that trauma or loss or illness disrupted. These are real and serious achievements. A skilled therapist can change a life, but notice the level at which all of this operates. Thought patterns, emotional responses, behavioral loops, relational dynamics. This is the territory of the psychic life, the level of feeling and function, of symptom and adaptation. And this is precisely the level therapy was designed to reach. Voegelin would say, and the sociologist Philip Rieff made a parallel argument in 1966 in his book The Triumph of the Therapeutic, that the 20th century made therapy into something it was never meant to be, not just a clinical practice, but a framework for understanding the human person. The therapeutic imagination began to crowd out other frameworks, philosophical, theological, spiritual, until the question, what is wrong with this person, was assumed to have a psychic answer. A diagnosis, a treatment protocol, an outcome measure. And what happened to the suffering that didn't fit? It either got redescribed in psychic terms. Here's your diagnosis, here are your medications, here is your treatment plan, or it got dismissed. You might need to adjust your expectations. Some things just take time. Have you considered that this is grief? The person sitting in that car on the drive home after the session that went well, they're not ungrateful. They're not resistant. They're confused because they've done the work, and the thing is still there. Voegelin's argument is that they're confused because they're trying to reach a spiritual disorder with a psychic tool. And those are not the same instrument. Here is the concept. The word is pneumopathology, from the Greek pneuma, spirit, and pathos, suffering or disease, literally, a disease of the spirit. Voegelin introduced it in a text called Science, Politics, and Gnosticism, which he delivered as a lecture in Munich in 1959. To understand what he meant, you need to understand what Voegelin thought the human soul was for. He drew heavily on Plato, specifically on a concept Plato called the metaxy, the in-between. The idea is this. The human being lives in a particular tension. We are not divine. We cannot see the whole of reality, cannot resolve the ultimate questions, cannot possess the ground of being as an object of knowledge. But we are not merely animal either. We are capable of asking those questions. We feel their pull. The soul has, in Voegelin's language, an openness toward the divine ground, a capacity to live in the question, to remain oriented toward something beyond itself without being able to fully grasp it. This in-between, the metaxy, is not a problem to be solved. It is the proper condition of the human soul, The soul that can hold that tension, that can remain open to transcendence without demanding a closed answer, is what Voegelin calls the soul in order. Now, pneumopathology is what happens when that openness is forcibly closed. Voegelin's paradigm cases in the 1959 lecture were Hegel and Marx. Both men, he argued, began with genuine philosophical questions about history, about consciousness, about the relationship between the human and the divine. And both men arrived at closed systems, Hegel's absolute spirit, Marx's dialectical materialism. In each case, the openness of the soul toward the transcendent ground was replaced by a constructed immanent answer, a system that explained everything, required no further questioning, and treated the mystery of existence as a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be inhabited. Voegelin called this a disease, not a philosophical error to be corrected by better arguments, but a spiritual deformation. And he made a claim that I want you to sit with. This deformation is not reachable by rational persuasion. You cannot argue a pneumopathic person out of their system. The disorder is pre-rational. It operates at the level of the pneuma, the spirit's orientation toward being, not at the level of the intellect. The closed system is not the cause of the disorder, it is the symptom. The cause is the closing itself. This is why therapy cannot reach it. Therapy can address the thoughts a person has about their closed system, the feelings it generates, the behaviors it produces, but it cannot address the spiritual act of closing, the moment the soul turned away from the question it was made to carry. The diagnostic test Voegelin offers is remarkably simple. It is not about the content of your beliefs. It is not about how much suffering you carry. It is this: can you still ask the question that frightens you most? Can you still sit with the genuine uncertainty about whether God is there? Can you still hold the possibility that the political framework you've lived inside might be incomplete? Can you still feel the pull of a truth that hasn't arrived yet? If the answer is yes, if the question is still alive in you even when it hurts, the metaxy is intact. The soul is still in order, even if it's in pain. If the answer is no, if every question has been replaced by a conclusion, every uncertainty foreclosed by a system, every frightening opening sealed by an answer you chose because it was safer to have one, that is where pneumopathology begins. I want to stop for a moment and say something about limits. Voegelin was a philosopher, not a clinician. Pneumopathology is not a clinical diagnosis. If you're suffering, and especially if that suffering is severe, it does not replace what a good therapist, a good pastor, or a good doctor can offer. What I'm describing is a level of human experience that those frameworks don't reach. I'm not describing what they treat poorly, but I do want you to be honest with yourself about whether the thing that hasn't shifted is the kind of thing Voegelin is naming. Now let me show you how wide this runs. Because pneumopathology, in Voegelin's analysis, isn't only what happens to individual people in private suffering. It's what happens to civilizations. In The New Science of Politics, published in 1952, 7 decades before the confusion you're watching on your phone every evening, Voegelin made a structural argument about modernity. The great political movements of the modern age, he argued, are driven by what he called the Gnostic impulse. The word Gnostic comes from the ancient heresy he used as a template, a worldview that divides reality into the good, spirit, knowledge, the enlightened, and the evil, matter, ignorance, the corrupt, and that promises liberation through the possession of special knowledge and the transformation of the corrupt order. Voegelin's argument, and this is the one that becomes a prediction, is that modern ideologies are structurally Gnostic. They locate a source of evil, a class, a race, a system, an establishment. They promise a saved order after the evil is eliminated, and they claim for their movement a special knowledge that justifies the elimination. And the key move, the one he made famous in that phrase you've heard but may not have fully unpacked, is what he called immanentizing the eschaton. Immanentize is not a word you use every day, and it's worth taking a moment with it. The eschaton is the final divine order, the kingdom, in Christian language. The fulfillment that classical and Christian thought always placed beyond history, beyond human achievement, in the transcendent. To immanentize the eschaton is to drag that final fulfillment into history, to treat the kingdom as something human beings can build. Now, through the right political program, the right system, the right movement. When that happens, Voegelin argues, the political project becomes a substitute religion. It carries the emotional and spiritual weight of salvation, and it generates the pathology he predicted. Because you cannot actually build the kingdom by political means, The gap between the promised paradise and the reality of the world must be explained. The explanation is always the same. There are enemies. The project would have worked if not for them. The enemies must be eliminated. And then, there are more enemies. The disorder compounds itself. The pneumopathic civilization regenerates the very disorder it's trying to cure. Here is what is remarkable. C.S. Lewis, writing from a completely different tradition, literary, Christian, not political philosophical, arrived at almost the same diagnosis in 1943, 9 years before Voegelin's New Science. In The Abolition of Man, Lewis described what he called the debunking of the chest. The chest, in Lewis's anatomy, is the faculty that mediates between reason and appetite, what the ancient Greeks called thumos, the seat of honor, aspiration, and the pull towards something greater than the self. Lewis argued that modern education, by treating every impulse toward transcendence as merely subjective, you only feel that way because of your upbringing, your culture, your psychology, was producing people without chests, people in whom the mediating faculty had been hollowed out. What Lewis called the hollow chest, Voegelin called the closed pneuma. Different vocabulary, different tradition, same diagnosis. The human capacity for transcendent orientation was being systematically destroyed, and the destroying force wasn't necessarily godlessness. It was the immanent substitute, the closed answer that made the question unnecessary. That connection matters, because it means this isn't a partisan diagnosis. It isn't something that happened to the left and not the right. It isn't something that happened to the secular and not the religious. Voegelin is pointing at a structural disorder that crosses every camp. And here is where I have to ask you to stay with something uncomfortable. You came into this video with a pretty good sense of who the pneumopathic person is. You've probably been nodding along. The ideologue certain of systematic oppression. The politician certain of a stolen election. The technocrat who believes history has an arc and he knows which way it bends. These are real cases. Voegelin would recognize all of them. But here is the thing he would not let you skip. The closing of the soul is not a disorder that belongs to the godless. It can happen inside a church. It can happen inside a prayer you've said 10,000 times. It can happen when your faith stops being a question you live inside and becomes an answer you use to stop thinking. It can happen when tradition becomes a fortress instead of a home. When the purpose of every doctrine is no longer to orient the soul toward the transcendent, but to protect you from the disorientation of genuinely open questions. You know the feeling I'm describing. You drove home from a service that was, by every measure, sound. The theology was correct, the music was familiar, the people were kind, and you sat in the car and felt nothing. Not hostility, not grief, nothing. And you have never told a soul, because the language you have for that silence is either, "I need more faith," or "something is wrong with me." Voegelin offers a third possibility. What if the silence isn't evidence of your failure? What if it's the pneuma, the spirit, refusing to accept a substitute for the real thing? What if the restlessness you feel in a tradition that has become a closed system is not faithlessness, but the soul's last-ditch resistance to a closing that would be its death? The hollow church, the one that got the doctrine right and lost the question, can be a site of pneumopathology just as surely as the ideology that got the politics right and lost the transcendent. The disease doesn't care about your team. It cares about whether the soul is still open. This is the symmetric diagnosis. This is what separates Voegelin from every other thinker who makes you feel good about your side's superiority. He turned the instrument on everyone. He turned it on the institutions his audience loved. He turned it on himself. And he did it not out of cynicism. He was one of the most spiritually serious thinkers of the 20th century, but out of a conviction that the truth is not partisan, and that the disease will spread wherever the question is sealed. Now I want to tell you where this leaves you. Because a diagnosis that ends in despair is only half a diagnosis. If you want to go deeper into Voegelin's own words, not summaries, not someone else's explanation, but the passages themselves decoded, that's what the Voegelin Quotes Companion was built for. 50 of his most essential passages, each with a plain language explanation of what it means, why it matters, and where it applies in 2026. It's the resource I wish I'd had when I first encountered these ideas and couldn't find a door in. The link is in the description. Voegelin called the counter-movement anamnesis. The word is Plato's. It means recollection. the act of remembering what the soul already knows but has buried. In Voegelin's usage, anamnesis is the practice of returning to the question. Not a dramatic conversion, not a new ideology, not a technique. A practice, a daily willingness to sit inside the tension of the metaxy, to remain open to the transcendent without demanding a closed answer, to carry the uncertainty without being destroyed by it. He began the project he called Order in History at the age of 55. He spent the last 30 years of his life into his 80s working on a 5-volume account of the human soul's struggle to remain in order across the whole of Western civilization. He never finished it. The final volume, published after his death, is incomplete. He knew it would be. He kept working anyway. That is not an accident. That is the lived demonstration of what he meant. The quest is the condition, not the arrival, not the closed answer. The willingness to keep asking, even when the answer doesn't come before you run out of time. Here is what anamnesis looks like in an ordinary life. It looks like the prayer you say not because you're certain it's heard, but because the act of saying it keeps a door open that you're afraid to close. It looks like reading something that challenges the framework you've lived inside, not to abandon the framework, but to find out how deep its roots actually go. It looks like the conversation with the adult child who speaks a moral language you don't recognize. And instead of shutting it down or surrendering to it, asking the question underneath it, what are they actually trying to hold on to? It looks like going back to the service on Sunday, not because it filled the silence, but because the silence itself is a form of honest waiting. Living in order, what Voegelin called the ordered soul, is not a destination. It is a practice, and it is one that anyone can take up today, in the actual life you have. The person in the car on the drive home from the session that went well is not broken. They are not a patient without a cure. They are a soul that is still, despite everything, asking the question it was made to ask. That is not a sign of failure. That is the beginning of order. Voegelin died in 1985 in Stanford, California, having fled tyranny, survived the century, and spent his life building a vocabulary for the disorder he watched spread across the Western world. He never believed the diagnosis was pessimistic. He believed, and he argued until the end, that the soul's capacity for orientation, its openness to the divine ground, cannot be permanently destroyed. It can be suppressed. It can be sealed by ideology, by habit, by fear, by a tradition that lost its nerve. But it persists. The question persists. That is, in Voegelin's reading, the deepest fact about what it means to be human. The question he would put to you, not in this video but in the silence after this video, is not whether you have the right answers. It is whether you can still feel the pull of the question you're most afraid to ask. If you can, the metaxy is intact. The soul is in order, even if it's in pain. And that is, in his diagnosis, enough to begin. Tell me the one thing you've stopped letting yourself question. The conviction, or the practice, or the tradition that you suspect would crack something open if you looked at it directly. I read these.